The wind screams across the Albanian mountains on the 9th of March, 1941, carrying sleet that cuts like shrapnel. Through the grey dawn, Hill 731 rises from the Trebeshina Massif, 731 meters of rock, ice, and blood. At this precise moment, Captain Dimitrios Kaslas of the Greek 5th Infantry Division crouches in a stone sangar, his frozen fingers checking his rifle for the 100th time. Below him, emerging like ghosts from the morning fog, are 3,000 soldiers of the Italian 9th Army. They have come to break him. Kaslas commands 147 men, exhausted, half-starved, their uniforms more holes than fabric, their ammunition counted in individual rounds rather than boxes. They have held this mountain for 4 months against an enemy that outnumbers them, outguns them, and by all rational calculation should have destroyed them weeks ago. But the Greeks have long since abandoned rational calculation. He glances at his watch. 6:58, 2 minutes until the Italian artillery begins. Behind him, in shallow fighting positions, scraped from frozen earth, his men wait. Some pray. Some smoke their last cigarettes. Some simply stare at the slope below, where death approaches with mathematical certainty. 147 men, 3,000 attackers, 731 meters of elevation that has become, in the mad logic of war, worth any price in blood. Kaslas thinks of his wife in Ioannina, wonders if she received his last letter, wonders if he will write another. The wind carries the smell of sulfur and wet stone and the peculiar metallic scent that comes before violence. 60 seconds. He touches the small icon of St. George tucked inside his coat, the saint who slew the dragon. Today, he thinks grimly, the dragon has artillery. 30 seconds. Down the line, Sergeant Yanis Stavro, who has not smiled since December, catches his eye and nods. No words needed. They have said everything there is to say. 10 seconds. The mountain holds its breath, and then the world explodes. Captain Dimitrios Kaslas was 31 years old when Operation Primavera found him on Hill 731. Born in 1810 in the Epirus region of northwestern Greece, he was the son of a school teacher who had fought in the Balkan Wars. Kaslas himself had trained as a civil engineer, planning to build bridges and roads for Greece's modernization. Instead, when Mussolini's ultimatum arrived on the 28th of October, 1940, he had reported to his reserve unit, kissed his wife and 2 young daughters goodbye, and marched north to the Albanian frontier. That was 4 months ago. It felt like 4 lifetimes. In his pocket, he carried a letter from his wife, dated February 14th. It had taken 3 weeks to reach him through the chaotic supply lines. She wrote about their daughters learning to read, about shortages in the city, about her faith that he would return. He had read it so many times the paper was falling apart at the folds. "I never imagined I would become a soldier," he had written in his diary on January 3rd. "I'm not naturally brave. I'm afraid every single day. But what choice do we have? They came to our country uninvited. They thought we would simply surrender. Instead, we have shown them that some things cannot be taken, only defended to the death. I pray it does not come to that. I suspect it will." On the other side of the valley, preparing for the assault, Lieutenant Alessandro Mariani of the 51st Infantry Division Siena performed his own ritual of preparation. 24 years old, from a prosperous family in Florence, he had joined the fascist party at 18, genuinely believing in Mussolini's vision of a new Roman Empire. He had volunteered for the Greek campaign with enthusiasm, certain it would be over in weeks. That was 5 months ago. The enthusiasm had long since frozen to death in the Albanian mountains. Mariani commanded a platoon of 42 men, down from the authorized strength of 50. The missing 8 were dead, wounded, or missing in action since November. His men were tired, demoralized, angry at their leadership, and increasingly doubtful about the whole fascist project. But they were still soldiers, and they would attack when ordered because that is what soldiers do. In his journal, recovered after the war and now held in the Italian state archives, Mariani wrote on March 8th, "Tomorrow we attack again. The officers speak confidently of breakthrough and victory. The men know better. We have attacked these Greeks a dozen times and been thrown back a dozen times. They fight like demons. They know this terrain. They are defending their homes. We are freezing in a country we have no business occupying, for reasons that become less clear every day. But orders are orders. I will lead my men tomorrow because that is my duty. God help us all." The third perspective belongs to a man who experienced the battle from a unique vantage point. Dr. Alekos Moraitis, a Greek military surgeon attached to the field hospital 5 kilometers behind Hill 731. 47 years old, he had given up a comfortable practice in Athens to serve with the army, driven by what he described as an obligation to share the suffering of my countrymen. His medical journal, donated to the Hellenic War Museum in 1978, provides clinical descriptions of wounds, treatments, and outcomes. But between the medical notations are observations of profound humanity. The men I treat are not heroes from mythology. They are farmers and shopkeepers and students. They shiver and cry out in pain and beg for their mothers. What makes them extraordinary is not that they lack fear, but that they continue despite it. That is courage, not the absence of fear, but its mastery. These 3 men, the Greek defender, the Italian attacker, the Greek healer, would all survive the Battle of Hill 731, though each would be fundamentally changed by it. Their testimony forms the skeleton of what we know about those terrible days in March of 1941. To understand how these men came to be locked in mortal combat on a frozen Albanian mountainside, we must step back 5 months and 2,000 kilometers. On the 28th of October, 1940, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the Italian ambassador to Greece delivered an ultimatum to Prime Minister Ioannis Metaxas. Italy demanded the right to occupy strategic locations throughout Greece. The ultimatum allowed 3 hours for response. Metaxas's answer, delivered in French, was brief. "Alors, c'est la guerre." Then, "It is war." According to popular legend, he simply said, "Ohi," no, a word that would become a rallying cry. Regardless of the exact phrasing, the response was unambiguous. Greece would not submit. At 5:30 that morning, Italian forces crossed the Albanian-Greek frontier at multiple points. Mussolini, seeking to rival Hitler's victories in France and Poland, expected a quick campaign. Greece had a population of 7 million versus Italy's 44 million. The Italian forces in Albania numbered 140,000 well-equipped troops. The Greeks could field perhaps 70,000 frontline soldiers, poorly equipped and lacking modern armor and air support. By every metric, Greece should have collapsed within weeks. Instead, the Greeks fought with ferocious determination. Within 3 weeks, they had not only halted the Italian advance, but pushed them back into Albania, capturing significant territory. By January of 1941, the Greeks occupied a quarter of Albania, and the Italians were reeling. The Greek resistance shocked everyone, including the Greeks themselves, explains Professor Maria Kostaridou of the University of Athens, specialist in World War II Balkan history. These were men who in many cases had never seen modern warfare, facing a supposedly superior force. But they had several advantages. They knew the terrain, they were defending their homeland, and they had extraordinarily capable leadership. General Papagos coordinated the defense brilliantly, but more than tactics, it was morale. The Greeks believed in what they were fighting for. Many of the Italians did not. The Italian defeats in Albania were humiliating for Mussolini's regime. Italian generals were dismissed. Reinforcements were rushed to Albania, eventually reaching over 500,000 men. And a major spring offensive was planned to restore Italian prestige and achieve the victory that had proven so elusive. Operation Primavera, the spring offensive, was conceived as a decisive blow. Launched on March 9, 1941, it involved coordinated attacks across the front, supported by heavy artillery and aircraft. The main effort targeted the Trebuchet Massif, a series of commanding heights that anchored the Greek defensive line. Hill 731 was one of those heights. The Italians genuinely believed Primavera would succeed, notes Professor Giovanni Bartoli of the University of Rome, author of Mussolini's Greek Disaster. They had concentrated overwhelming force, improved their logistics, brought in fresh units. On paper, they should have smashed through. But war is not fought on paper. The Greeks were dug in on positions they'd fortified for months. The weather was atrocious, and the Italian soldiers, after months of failure and hardship, were not the enthusiastic fascists of propaganda films. They were cold, hungry, and increasingly cynical. You cannot manufacture morale by decree. On Hill 731, Captain Kaslas and his men had spent the winter preparing for exactly this moment. They had built stone sangars, defensive positions using the abundant rock, and cleared fields of fire. They had cached ammunition and medical supplies in multiple locations in case positions were overrun. They had rehearsed fallback positions and counterattack routes. Mostly, they had waited and frozen and endured. Now, at 6:58 on the morning of March 9th, the waiting was over. The Italian artillery opens fire with a sound that obliterates thought. Kaslas presses himself against the stone wall of his sangar as the world becomes nothing but noise and concussion. The shells, 75mm, 100mm, and the deeper crashing booms of 149mm heavy guns walk across Hill 731 in a systematic pattern designed to destroy every defensive position. The earth heaves. Stone splinters fill the air like shrapnel. The concussion waves hit Kaslas in the chest, making it hard to breathe. He has survived bombardments before, but never anything this intense. The Italians have committed truly massive artillery support to Primavera. Through the chaos, he tries to keep awareness of his men. Some positions have telephone lines, a fragile field wire connecting the defensive network. Most of those are cut within the first 2 minutes. Now it is down to runners, men brave enough to sprint through the barrage carrying messages. Private Kostas Dimitrou, a shepherd boy from the mountains near Metsovo, appears in Kaslas's sangar, materializing out of the smoke like a ghost. He is 19 years old. Blood runs from his nose, concussion from a near miss. "Second platoon reports heavy casualties," he shouts over the noise. "Lieutenant Pappas is dead. Sergeant Macris has assumed command." Kaslas nods, writes a quick message acknowledging receipt, sends Dimitrou back into the maelstrom. The boy disappears into smoke. Kaslas will learn later that he made it, delivered 3 more messages, and was killed by shell fragments on his 5th run. He would be posthumously promoted to corporal. The bombardment continues for 47 minutes. This is not harassing fire or preparatory shelling. This is an attempt to erase Hill 731 from existence. In his position 30 meters downslope, Sergeant Yanis Stavrou huddles with 4 of his men in a sangar that has partially collapsed from the shelling. One of his men, Private Alexopoulos, is crying, not from fear but from the sheer sensory overload. Stavrou grabs him by the shoulders, makes eye contact, holds his gaze until the boy's breathing steadies. No words. What could words accomplish against this? When the barrage lifts at 7:45, the sudden near silence is disorienting. Kaslas's ears ring. Smoke and dust make visibility perhaps 20 meters. He pulls himself up, looks over the sangar wall, trying to assess damage. The hillside is transformed. Positions that were carefully camouflaged are now raw craters. Several sangars have taken direct hits, their defenders simply gone. The telephone wire is shredded. But men are stirring, pulling themselves from cover, checking weapons with the automatic movements of training. And down below, through the thinning smoke, the Italian infantry begins its ascent. Lieutenant Mariani leads his platoon up the slope, trying to maintain formation in the difficult terrain. The bombardment has churned the hillside into a moonscape of craters and debris. His men advance in short rushes, using what cover exists. They have rehearsed this. They know the plan. First wave pins the defenders, second wave exploits, third wave consolidates. Simple, clean, professional. The reality is never simple. At 150 meters from the Greek positions, the first rifle shots crack out. Mariani sees one of his men, Corporal Rossi, a bricklayer from Perugia, stumble and fall, shot through the chest. The medic rushes to him, but Mariani can see it is useless. More fire now. The Greeks who survived the bombardment are making every shot count. The Italian advance slows as men seek cover. Mariani is screaming orders, trying to maintain momentum, because momentum is everything in an assault. Stop moving, and you die. The Italian machine guns open up, trying to suppress the Greek positions. Grenades arc through the air. The Italians have superior firepower, better equipment, tactical air support standing by. Against any reasonable enemy, this should work. If you appreciate stories like this, these deep explorations of battles that tested human limits, where we go beyond the simple narratives of victory and defeat to understand the actual experience of combat, then please consider subscribing to Not Nostalgic History. We're committed to telling these stories with the depth, nuance, and respect they deserve, bringing you the human truth behind historical events. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, because there are countless more stories of courage and sacrifice waiting to be told properly. The Greeks are not reasonable. They are desperate, defending their homeland against an invasion they never invited. They fight with a ferocity born of righteous anger. Mariani reaches a crater 50 meters from the Greek line. Half his platoon is with him, the other half is pinned down or dead. He tries to organize a final rush, but the fire is too heavy. Every time someone moves, Greek rifles crack with deadly accuracy. They are stuck. This is the nightmare scenario, caught in the open, unable to advance or retreat, taking casualties with nothing to show for it. Mariani calls for artillery support on the Greek positions, gives coordinates, waits in the crater while shells scream overhead and land among the sangars. Then the whistle blows, and they try again. For 6 hours, the battle rages across Hill 7-3-1. The Italians attack in waves, each time making it a little farther before being thrown back. The Greeks defend with everything they have: rifles, machine guns, grenades, even rocks when ammunition runs low. Captain Kaslas is everywhere, moving between positions, redistributing ammunition, pulling wounded to cover, shooting when targets present themselves. He has lost count of the Italian assaults. They blur together into one continuous test of endurance. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Pappas, is dead, killed in the initial bombardment. His first sergeant is badly wounded. The company medic has been treating wounded for hours, running out of supplies, doing what he can with bandages and morphine and prayers. At 1300 hours, the Italians nearly break through. A determined assault by 2 full companies pushes up the western slope, overwhelming the positions held by 2nd Platoon. Greek soldiers fall back fighting, contesting every meter. Kaslas commits his tiny reserve, 12 men who are supposed to rest and rotate with the forward positions. The counterattack is desperate and brutal. Close quarters fighting with rifles, bayonets, entrenching tools, fists. Sergeant Stavro kills 2 Italian soldiers at point-blank range, is wounded by a grenade, continues fighting with blood streaming down his face. Private Giorgio, an accountant from Thessaloniki, throws himself on an Italian soldier to prevent him from tossing a grenade into a sangar full of wounded. Both men die. The Greeks retake the lost positions. The Italian assault breaks. Men retreat down the slope, leaving their dead and some wounded behind. Kaslas stands amid the carnage, breathing hard, looking at the faces of his surviving men. They have held again. But the cost is mounting. Of his original 147 men, he estimates he has perhaps 90 still combat effective. Ammunition is running dangerously low. The field wire is cut. No communication with battalion headquarters. The wounded are mounting, men who need evacuation but cannot be moved while the battle continues. And the Italians will attack again. He is certain of it. 5 kilometers behind the lines, Dr. Moraitis prepares to receive casualties from Hill 731. His field hospital is a commandeered stone barn, minimally heated by a single wood stove, equipped with whatever medical supplies the chaotic Greek logistics system has managed to deliver. The first wounded arrive at 0900, carried on improvised stretchers or walking supported by comrades. Dr. Moraitis performs triage, sorting the wounded into those who need immediate treatment, those who can wait, and those for whom nothing can be done. This last category is the hardest. Looking into the eyes of a dying 20-year-old and knowing you must move on to someone who can be saved never becomes easier. Through the day, a steady stream of casualties flows down from the mountain. Gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, blast trauma, concussions, frostbite, exhaustion. Dr. Moraitis and his 2 assistants, neither formally trained, both learning battlefield medicine through brutal experience, work without pause. His journal entry for March 9th, written late that night by candlelight, reads, 23 dead, 41 wounded, of which perhaps 15 will survive. We have no antibiotics, insufficient morphine, and only the most basic surgical equipment. I am performing amputations with a bone saw that would not be acceptable in a civilian butcher shop. The men endure with remarkable stoicism. They apologize for bleeding on the floor. They ask when they can return to their units. I lie and tell them soon, knowing many will never fight again. What sustains them? I've asked this question repeatedly. The answer is always the same. Their comrades on the mountain need them. They cannot abandon their friends. This bond between soldiers is perhaps the strongest force in war, stronger than ideology, stronger than patriotism, even stronger than the instinct for self-preservation. They will die for each other. Many do. At 1500 hours, a runner arrives with a message from Hill 731. Captain Kaslas requests any available ammunition be sent forward immediately. The battalion supply officer responds that there is no ammunition to send. What exists must be reserved for the entire front. Dr. Moraitis watches the runner's face as he receives this answer. The young man, no more than 18, says nothing, simply nods and begins the trek back up the mountain to deliver the news that no help is coming. This, Dr. Moraitis reflects, is the reality of the Greek defense. Courage and determination fighting against impossible odds with inadequate support. That they have held this long is miraculous. That they continue to hold seems to violate natural law. Yet hold they do. The dawn of March 10th brings no respite. The Italian bombardment begins at 6:30, once again attempting to pulverize the Greek positions. The surviving defenders huddle in their sangars and endure. Captain Kaslas has spent the night reorganizing his shattered company. He now has 74 men capable of fighting. Ammunition has been pooled. Each rifleman has approximately 30 rounds. The machine guns have perhaps 200 rounds total. There are 17 grenades remaining in the entire company. This is not enough to repel a determined assault. Yet when the Italians come again at 0800, the Greeks meet them with fire. Every shot must count now. The Greek riflemen, many of them hunters and shepherds in civilian life, men who learned to shoot as boys, make their limited ammunition tell. Lieutenant Mariani's platoon, reinforced with replacements for yesterday's casualties, attacks up the same slope they failed to take the day before. The Greek positions they are assaulting are the same sangas that have already thrown back 6 Italian attacks. Mariani is exhausted, running on coffee and fear and the momentum of events beyond his control. He no longer believes in breakthrough or victory. He simply obeys orders because the alternative, refusing, turning back, is unthinkable. His men reach the crater field where they stalled yesterday. The Greek fire seems lighter, fewer machine guns, less volume. Are the defenders weakening, or is this a trap? He orders his men forward. They close to within 30 meters of the Greek positions before the defenders unveil their surprise. A carefully hoarded reserve of grenades, thrown all at once in a devastating barrage. The Italian attack recoils. In his sangar, Sergeant Stavru, head bandaged, arm in a makeshift sling, permits himself a grim smile. The Greeks cannot win this battle through superior firepower. They can only win through superior cunning and will. Every Italian attack they repel is a small victory. Enough small victories might add up to survival. The morning dissolves into familiar patterns. Attack, defense, casualties, brief pause, another attack. The mountain is carpeted with dead and wounded from both sides. The smell of cordite and blood hangs in the cold air. At noon, Kaslas receives unexpected news via runner. Greek reinforcements are being sent, a full company from the reserve battalion. They will arrive tonight and relieve his shattered force. He almost weeps with relief. His men have done enough. More than enough. They have held for 2 days against overwhelming odds. Now they can rest. The runner also brings news from the wider front. Operation Primavera is failing. The Italians have achieved local successes, but no breakthrough. The Greek line is bending but not breaking. If they can hold another day, the Italian offensive will culminate and fail. One more day. Kaslas passes the word to his men. Hold until nightfall. Relief is coming, just hold, they do. At 1600 hours on March 10th, the Italians launch their final desperate assault on Hill 731. This time, they commit everything. A full battalion, supported by every available artillery piece and mortar, with aircraft strafing the Greek positions immediately before the infantry attack. The bombardment is beyond anything that came before. The Italians are throwing ammunition they can ill afford to expend in one last attempt to break the defenders. Kaslas's sangars, already battered by 2 days of shelling, begin to collapse. He loses contact with his flanking units. The world narrows to his immediate vicinity, the dozen men in his sangar, and the slope before them where hundreds of Italian infantry are advancing. The Greeks fire their last ammunition with disciplined precision. When the rifles run dry, they fix bayonets. When grenades are gone, they prepare to fight with rocks and rifle butts and bare hands if necessary. The Italians reach the Greek positions and close combat erupts. Lieutenant Mariani, leading from the front, despite every instinct screaming at him to stay back, charges into a Greek sangar, fires his pistol twice, grapples with a Greek soldier. They fall together, rolling in the mud and blood, each trying to kill the other. Sergeant Stavru appears, rifle raised, but hesitates. His own officer is locked in the struggle, impossible to get a clean shot. The Italian, Mariani, manages to throw off his opponent and scramble away. For a brief instant, he and Stavru lock eyes across 3 meters of contested ground. Neither fires. Each recognizes in the other a fellow soldier doing his duty in a war neither asked for. Then the moment passes and the combat continues. The melee rages for 20 minutes of pure chaos. Small unit cohesion breaks down into individual fights for survival. Training is discarded in favor of animal desperation. Men die in ways they never imagined when they joined their respective armies. And then, impossibly, the Italians begin to fall back. They have reached their culminating point. the moment when exhaustion, casualties, and loss of momentum make further advance impossible. The survivors retreat down the slope, some carrying wounded, others simply fleeing, all of them finished. The Greeks, reduced now to perhaps 40 men still able to fight, watch them go in stunned silence. They have won. Or rather, they have not lost. In the mathematics of defense, these amount to the same thing. Captain Kaslas sits with his back against the stone wall of his sangar, his rifle across his knees, and allows himself to breathe. Around him, his men emerge from positions, checking on each other, beginning the grim work of counting the dead. Of his original 147 men, 42 are dead, 63 are wounded, and 42 remain combat effective. These numbers will be recorded in the unit history with clinical precision. They represent brothers, friends, husbands, sons, reduced to statistics in a ledger. But they held Hill 731. At 1900 hours, as darkness falls, the relief company arrives. Fresh troops, relatively well equipped, ready to take over the position. Kaslas's survivors gather what gear they can carry and begin the march down to the rear. They leave behind their dead to be buried later, and the mountain they purchased with blood. Operation Primavera continued until March 16th, 1941, achieving limited territorial gains at enormous cost. The Italians suffered approximately 12,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. The Greeks suffered approximately 8,000. Neither side could afford such losses. More importantly, Primavera failed in its strategic objective. The Greek line bent but did not break. The Italian offensive culminated without achieving breakthrough. Mussolini's dream of a victorious spring campaign ended in another embarrassing stalemate. 3 weeks later, on April 6th, Germany invaded Greece. Operation Mariani, the German Balkan campaign, involved overwhelming force and professional execution. Where the Italians had failed for 5 months, the Germans succeeded in 3 weeks. By the end of April, Greece was occupied, its army defeated by sheer overwhelming might. But those 3 weeks of German victory came after 5 months of Italian failure. The Greek resistance had delayed Axis plans, forced Hitler to divert forces south that he intended for other operations, and provided one of the first instances of Axis defeat in World War II. The strategic significance of the Greek-Italian War is often underappreciated, notes Professor Kostaridou. The Greeks didn't just resist, they defeated Italian offensives repeatedly. This had several effects. It delayed the Axis timetable in the Balkans by months, it forced Hitler to intervene and rescue Mussolini, and most importantly for morale, it showed the world that the Axis powers were not invincible. The Greeks paid a terrible price, but their resistance mattered. Captain Dimitrios Kaslas survived the war, though he never fully recovered from wounds received in subsequent fighting against the Germans. He returned to Ioannina in 1945 to find his city damaged, but his family alive. He resumed his engineering career, building the roads and bridges he had dreamed of before the war interrupted. He rarely spoke about his military service, but he maintained contact with survivors of his company, attending reunions until his death in 1973 at age 63. His daughter donated his diary and letters to the Hellenic War Museum. The diary entry for March 10, 1941, written weeks later from memory as the original was lost in subsequent fighting, reads, "We held because we had no choice. The alternative was to abandon Greece to invaders. Some choices are not really choices at all. I lost so many good men on that mountain. I see their faces still. They died defending their country. I suppose there are worse deaths, but I struggle to imagine any more tragic. They were so young." Lieutenant Alessandro Mariani survived Operation Primavera, but was captured by the Germans in 1943 after Italy's surrender. He spent the remainder of the war in a prison camp in Poland. Repatriated in 1946, He returned to Florence, renounced fascism, and became a teacher. He maintained that his time in Albania taught him the fundamental immorality of aggressive war. In a 1967 interview for an Italian documentary on the Greek campaign, Mariani said, "We were told we were heroes, bringing civilization to the Greeks. This was nonsense. The Greeks were civilized 2,000 years before Rome. We were invaders, and they fought us as any people would fight invaders. I'm not proud of what we did. I'm only glad I survived to recognize the wrong of it. Many of my comrades were not so fortunate." Dr. Alekos Moraitis continued to serve with the Greek army throughout the war, treating wounded during the German invasion and later working with resistance groups. He was arrested by the Germans in 1943 and died in custody, officially of typhus, though family members suspected worse. His medical journals were preserved by his wife and eventually donated to the War Museum, where they remain an invaluable primary source. His final journal entry, dated March 1941, reads, "The war continues. The men continue to suffer. I continue to patch them together and send them back to suffer more. I wonder sometimes if I'm helping or simply enabling a terrible machinery. But individual men in pain ask for help, and I cannot refuse them. That is perhaps the only moral clarity war allows, the immediate necessity of relieving suffering, even if the broader context is madness. To understand Hill 7, 3-1's place in the larger war, we must zoom out from individual experience to strategic consequences. The Greek victory in the winter campaign of 1940-41 had ripple effects throughout the war. Most significantly, it forced Hitler to divert forces to the Balkans in spring of 1941, forces he had intended for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Barbarossa was delayed by approximately 5 weeks to deal with the Balkan situation. Those 5 weeks meant German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow in early December rather than early November. They encountered winter weather without having defeated the Soviet Union. This delay, while not the only factor, contributed to the failure to capture Moscow and the beginning of Germany's eventual defeat on the Eastern Front. The counterfactual is impossible to prove definitively, explains Dr. Richard Evans, professor of modern European history at Cambridge University. But the evidence suggests that the delay caused by the Balkan campaign had real consequences. Hitler's generals certainly believed that those lost weeks mattered. The irony is profound. Greek soldiers fighting desperately on mountains in Albania contributed indirectly to the survival of the Soviet Union and the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. They never knew it. They were just trying to defend their homes. The Greek resistance also had morale implications, beyond the military realm. In spring of 1941, Britain stood essentially alone against the Axis. France had fallen. The United States had not yet entered the war. Every German and Italian victory seemed to confirm their inevitable triumph. Then tiny Greece, outmatched and outnumbered, defeated Italy repeatedly. The symbolism was powerful. Churchill said of the Greeks, "Hence we will not say that Greeks fight like heroes, but that heroes fight like Greeks." The phrase became famous, capturing the world's admiration for Greek courage. This mattered psychologically. It demonstrated that resistance was possible, that the Axis could be defeated, that courage and determination could overcome numerical odds. For occupied peoples throughout Europe, the Greek example provided hope. The price, of course, was paid by Greeks. The occupation that followed was brutal. Famine, reprisals, resistance, civil war. Greece would suffer terribly for years. The heroes of Hill 7, 3-1 bought strategic delay and morale victory with currency of blood and suffering. Were their sacrifices worth it? The question assumes a level of choice they didn't have. The Italians invaded. The Greeks could surrender or fight. They chose to fight. The consequences, strategic, tactical, personal, flowed from that choice. Today, Hill 7. 3-1 rises from the Albanian landscape much as it did in March 1941. The sangars are mostly collapsed, overgrown with vegetation. The shell craters have softened with decades of erosion. Shepherds graze their flocks on slopes where men once killed each other with desperate intensity. But traces remain. In 2011, a team of Greek and Albanian researchers conducted an archaeological survey of the Greek-Italian war battlefields, including Hill 731. They found bullet casings, grenade fragments, pieces of equipment, and, in 3 locations, human remains. The remains were treated with full military honors, buried in the military cemetery at Ioannina, where so many Greek soldiers from the Albanian front are interred. DNA testing was not possible. Too much time had passed. The bones were labeled simply Unknown Greek Soldier, Hill 731. March 1941. Perhaps one of them was Private Giorgio, the accountant who threw himself on an Italian soldier. Perhaps Private Dimitro, the shepherd boy who ran messages until he died. Perhaps someone whose name never made it into any account, who died unmourned and unrecorded. Another atom in the vast structure of historical violence. What strikes you about these battlefield sites, reflects Dr. Eleni Papadopoulou, lead archaeologist on the survey team, is how thoroughly nature reclaims them. Within decades, the scars of battle fade. The mountains endure regardless of human conflicts. There's something both comforting and tragic about that. Comforting because the wounds heal. Tragic because the healing erases the evidence of what happened, who suffered, what it cost. Our job as historians and archaeologists is to resist that erasure, to insist on remembering even when nature and time conspire to forget. Local Albanian villagers near Hill 731 maintain oral traditions about the Battle of the Greeks. Stories, embellished and distorted over 3 generations, but retaining essential truth. A terrible battle was fought here. Men died in the frozen mud. Courage was abundant on all sides. Some villagers report finding artifacts occasionally, a rusted helmet, a corroded rifle, a belt buckle. These are collected and sometimes sent to museums, sometimes kept as family curiosities, talismans of a history they witnessed only indirectly. In Greece, Hill 731 is commemorated as one of the defensive victories of the Albanian campaign. Veterans organizations maintain its memory. School children learn about it as part of the broader story of Greek resistance. But as the generation that fought passes away, the last combat veterans of the Greek-Italian War died in the early 2000s. The memory becomes increasingly abstract. We are entering the phase where the war passes from living memory to history, notes Professor Kostaridou. This is both natural and concerning. Natural because this is how human societies process trauma. Those who experienced it die, and those who inherit the memory relate to it differently. Concerning because we risk losing the human particularity of these events. Hill 7. 3. One can become just a name, a date, a tactical footnote. We must fight against that flattening. We must remember that real humans died there in the mud and cold, that their fear and courage were as real as ours, that their sacrifice purchased something valuable even if the exact value is hard to calculate. What does Hill 731 teach us, 83 years after the guns fell silent? First, it reminds us that small nations can resist great powers, at least temporarily, when defending their homeland. The Greek defense of Hill 7. 3-1 was tactically successful, not because of superior equipment or numbers, they had neither, but because of superior morale, knowledge of terrain, and defensive preparation. The same dynamic has played out throughout history, from Marathon to Thermopylae to modern insurgencies. The defender willing to pay in blood can exact costs that make conquest prohibitively expensive. This is not an argument for the inevitability of successful defense. Greece ultimately fell to Germany. but the 5 months of successful resistance against Italy mattered. It delayed Axis plans, demonstrated that resistance was possible, and inflicted costs. Sometimes delaying defeat is victory enough. Second, Hill 7-3-1 illustrates the limits of military superiority. The Italians had more men, more guns, more equipment, air superiority, and better logistics. They should have won. That they did not reflects the reality that wars are fought by humans, and human factors, morale, leadership, belief in the cause, can outweigh material factors. This is the lesson that great powers repeatedly failed to learn, suggests Dr. Sarah Chen, professor of military history at Yale University. They count tanks and aircraft and tons of supplies, and conclude that victory is inevitable. Then they encounter an enemy who refuses to accept the mathematics, who fights beyond what seems rational, and suddenly the equations don't work. The Italians in Greece, the Americans in Vietnam, the Soviets in Afghanistan. The pattern repeats. Material superiority is important, but not determinative. Will matters. Third, the battle reminds us that courage exists on all sides of conflicts. Captain Kaslas displayed extraordinary bravery and leadership. So did Lieutenant Mariani, attacking up slopes where he knew death waited. The Greek soldiers who held their positions against overwhelming odds were heroes. So were the Italian soldiers who kept attacking despite repeated failure, because their duty demanded it. We can acknowledge this universal courage while still recognizing that the causes were not morally equivalent. The Greeks were defending against unprovoked invasion. The Italians were prosecuting a war of aggression begun by a fascist dictator seeking imperial glory. Moral judgment of the war does not require us to deny the humanity of individual soldiers. Fourth, Hill 7-3-1 demonstrates the enduring importance of eyewitness testimony and primary sources. We know about this battle in human detail because Kaslas kept a diary, because Mariani wrote in his journal, because Dr. Moraitis recorded his observations. Without these voices, Hill 7-3-1 would be a paragraph in a military history, a tactical engagement, some casualty figures, strategic irrelevance. The personal accounts transform it into human story. They allow us to understand not just what happened, but what it felt like, what it cost in immediate human terms. This is why we must preserve veterans' testimonies, collect oral histories, maintain archives. The raw data of history, dates, numbers, outcomes, matters less than the human experience of historical events. Finally, Hill 7-3-1 teaches us about the enduring cost of war. The battle ended on March 10th, but for the men who fought it, the battle never entirely ended. Kaslas saw the faces of his dead men for the rest of his life. Mariani renounced the ideology that sent him up that slope, but couldn't erase the experience. Dr. Moraitis carried the weight of the suffering he witnessed. War's costs compound over lifetimes. The direct casualties, 104 dead between both sides on Hill 7-3-1 alone, are only the beginning. The wounded carry their injuries, the witnesses carry their memories, the families carry the absence, the societies carry the trauma, the costs cascade through generations. We talk about the cost of war in immediate terms, casualties, material destruction, economic impact, reflects Dr. James Henderson. These are real and important, but the true cost is often psychological and multi-generational. The veterans who can't sleep, the widows and orphans, the communities torn apart, the cycles of trauma that perpetuate through families. Hill 7-3-1 involved a few hundred men fighting for a few days, but the ripples from that battle spread across decades and continents, touching thousands of lives. That's the true price of those few days in March. We began on a frozen mountainside at dawn, with Captain Kaslas counting down the seconds until violence arrived. We end 8 decades later, with that violence receded into memory, its participants mostly dead, The world they fought over transformed beyond their recognition. The Greek-Albanian border is peaceful now. Greece and Italy are partners in the European Union, allies in NATO, trading partners and tourist destinations for each other's citizens. The ideologies that animated the war, fascism, militant nationalism, are discredited or diminished. The strategic concerns of March 1941 seem impossibly distant. Yet Hill 731 still rises from the landscape, indifferent to human conflicts, bearing silent witness to what occurred there. The question that haunts any study of battles like this is, what was it for? What did they achieve? Were the 104 dead, the 163 wounded, the countless traumatized survivors justified by any outcome? The answers are neither simple nor satisfying. The tactical victory, holding the hill, repelling the Italian attacks, was real but temporary. The strategic victory, delaying Axis plans, contributing to the eventual Allied victory, was real but indirect and purchased at terrible price. The moral victory, demonstrating that resistance to aggression is possible, was real but cold comfort to the dead. Perhaps the most honest answer is that the men of Hill 731 fought because they had to. Captain Kaslas couldn't abandon his position without abandoning Greece. Lieutenant Mariani couldn't refuse orders without destroying himself. The individual soldiers on both sides couldn't escape the historical currents that had swept them up and deposited them on that frozen slope. They did their duty as they understood it, in circumstances they didn't choose, with consequences they couldn't foresee. They were brave and afraid, competent and overwhelmed, human in all the complicated ways humans are. And we, the inheritors of the world they shaped through their suffering, owe them memory. Not mythologized memory that transforms them into marble heroes, devoid of fear and doubt. Not sanitized memory that erases the horror and waste, but honest memory that acknowledges both their courage and the tragedy of the circumstances that demanded that courage. We remember Captain Kaslas, who wanted to build bridges but learned to defend mountains, who survived the war but left part of himself on Hill 731. We remember Lieutenant Mariani, who believed in fascist dreams and learned through blood and cold that dreams can be murderous lies, who had the integrity to admit his wrong and spent his life atoning. We remember Dr. Moraitis, who chose healing in the midst of killing, who witnessed suffering and recorded it so that we might understand. We remember the named and unnamed dead, Private Giorgio and Private Dimitru and Corporal Rossi and Lieutenant Papas, and the 99 others who fell on Hill 731, and the thousands more who fell on similar hills across Albania and Greece. We remember the wounded, the traumatized, the ones who carried the war home in their bodies and minds. We remember because forgetting would diminish us, because these events happened and matter, because understanding the specific human cost of historical violence is essential to preventing future violence. The fundamental question, suggests Professor Costaridou, is what we do with historical memory of events like Hill 731. Do we use them to feed nationalist mythologies, to glorify war and military virtues? That path leads to more wars. Do we use them to condemn all violence and retreat into pacifism? That path ignores the reality that sometimes resistance is necessary. I think the right path is to remember the full complexity, the courage and the waste, the necessity and the tragedy, the individual humanity and the systemic violence. To say, this happened, it mattered, it cost terribly, and we must learn from it without simplifying it. Hill 7:3. One stands as testament to human capacity for both courage and destruction. The same species that creates art and builds civilizations also wages war and destroys. The same individuals who love their families and dream of peaceful futures also kill each other on frozen mountainsides when history demands it. This paradox is uncomfortable. It resists easy resolution. But dwelling in that discomfort is important. It keeps us from the twin errors of cynicism, believing humans are merely violent beasts, and sentimentalism, believing we have transcended our capacity for organized violence. We are what we have always been. Capable of extraordinary courage and compassion, capable of terrible cruelty and destruction, shaped by circumstances we partly create and partly inherit, muddling through as best we can. The men of Hill 7-3. One were not different from us. They were us, placed in extreme circumstances. Their fear, their courage, their confusion, their determination, these are human universals. We carry the same capacities they carried. Under similar pressures, we might respond similarly. This should humble us. It should make us grateful that we live in circumstances that do not demand we kill or die on frozen mountains. It should make us committed to preserving and expanding those circumstances. To building a world where fewer people face the impossible choices that Captain Kaslas and Lieutenant Mariani faced. And it should make us remember. Always remember. Remember Hill 7-3-1. Not because the battle was strategically decisive, it wasn't. Not because it represents some glorious chapter in military history, it represents tragedy more than glory. But because it happened, because real humans suffered through it, because their experience contains truths about courage and fear, duty and waste, resistance and cost that remain relevant. The sun sets over the Albanian mountains today, much as it set on March 10th, 1941. The hills endure, the battles fade. The soldiers are mostly gone now, passed into history, but their story remains, their sacrifice remains. The questions they raise about war, duty, courage, and cost remain. We inherit those questions. We inherit the obligation to remember. We inherit the duty to learn. May we prove worthy of the inheritance. May we remember honestly, learn deeply, and commit ourselves to building a world where fewer must pay the price that was paid on Hill 7-3-1. May the dead rest, and may the living remember.